You're listening to The Dating Den with dating and relationship badass and best-selling author Marni Battista. Every week, you'll get the raw truth from top experts and real people on the important dating, sex, and relationship issues you want to know about. So if you're ready for true talk that's authentic and unfiltered, and you're not afraid to be called out on your stuff, then you're ready for what's next.
The Dating Den with Drs. Susan Matt and Luke Fernandez. What social media and technology might be doing to undermine your love life. Ladies, welcome into the Dating Den today. Oh my gosh, I love this topic. You are going to be so happy to talk to Drs. Susan Matt and Dr. Luke Fernandez. They are the authors, love this title, Bored, Lonely, Angry, Stupid, Changing Feelings About Technology from the Telegraph to Twitter. Oh my God, I can't wait to talk about this, you guys. Luke is the assistant professor in the School of Computing at Weber State University. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Salon, and Slate, and other places. And Susan is a professor of history at Weber State. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. I also just have to know, to start off, guys, did you meet at school?
We met in grad school in a political philosophy class. Very, very sexy place.
Oh my gosh, that's so amazing. And so then you set your life up to where you guys both work at the same institution and you're partnered in life and in work. That's so cool. Is that right? I just made a giant assumption.
Yeah, Susan got a job in history here in at Weber State, and then I followed her here.
That's so cool. I said it wrong. It's Weber State. I didn't even know that. Where is Weber State?
It's just north of Salt Lake City in Utah.
Oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful, I freaking love Utah. It's so beautiful. We'll have to talk about that later. I'm so happy that you guys are here. So, you know, when you, just the title of your book, what was the inspiration or impetus for you to write this book about this really important topic?
You know, we were about 10 years ago thinking about the growing flurry of news stories about how social media was changing our personalities. And there'd be all these stories about, you know, is Facebook making us lonely? Is Google making us stupid? Are we becoming narcissistic and self-obsessed because of our social media feeds? And Luke studies the social effects of technology, and I study the history of feelings, and we felt there was this convergence of our interests. Like, we should maybe look at these questions that are roiling today about how our personalities are changing and try to understand how earlier generations coped with technological change and how they experienced feelings like loneliness or boredom. And so it was a nice way to bring together our interests.
That's amazing. Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, it was triggered sort of most immediately. We were teaching in the classroom and noticing that our students seemed to be distracted by their smartphones or even their cell phones, because this dates back 15 years. And so one of our first interests was, you know, are cell phones and are these new technologies making us more distracted? Is it reducing our attention spans? And so that sort of anxiety, which some sociologists have called a moral panic, we realized was only just one moral panic of many. And like Susan was saying, you know, the question or anxiety about are these technologies reducing our attention span? We realized also had a bunch of other worries associated with it. Like, are we more angry as a result of our cell phones? Are we more lonely? Are we more bored? Are we less capable of awe? Are we more prideful or more narcissistic? Yeah,
I'm thinking probably the answer to all those questions is yes. Yes, we are. Well, let me tell you this, because I want to set this framework up, and this is why I'm like obsessed about your topic. So in last December, the end of 2020, I decided that social media was making me do all those things that you guys are talking about, and so I did a little experiment, and I just sort of took a break. And then I ultimately decided to just peace out of social media. And so I've been doing it for about 3 or 4 months. And I have just noticed so many different things in my life as a result of this experiment that I've continued to take on. And so I'm wondering, because what I noticed is, and I took everything off my phone, and I still have the habit when I am like anxious, like especially if I'm watching something or seeing something that's making me anxious, I still go on my phone. I'm like looking for the apps that don't exist. So how is this experience of loneliness, boredom, anxiety, like how is that showing up? And then I'm curious how it's changed over time, like because those feelings have been around far longer than technology.
Right. So all that stuff you're talking about, sometimes we'll call it digital detox or moving off the grid or taking a digital Sabbath. You'll see lots of articles these days in the media talking about ways of dealing with these particular aspects of, of the 21st century condition and the way our technology is changing us. But and I think Susan can speak to this better than I can because she's the historian. But what we wanted to do in our book was say, hey, these anxieties are not just things that have cropped up in the last 15 or 20 years, in the wake of the development of social media, but actually have a much longer vintage. Let's see if we can sort of look back into the more distant past, into the 19th century and see whether there are anxieties that Americans harbored about the technologies of their own era that parallel or resonate with the ones we have today as a way of maybe sort of deepening our present understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, so, in response to your comment about, turning to your phone instinctively, we talk about that a lot of places in the book, but certainly we have a chapter on boredom and it crops up there. We've become so accustomed over the last 100 years to having technology to distract us when we have empty moments or anxious moments. And what we found was that it was only in the 19th century that the word boredom even got created. The word bore and boring come in a little, 50 years before that. But people were just more accustomed to monotony and tedium and dullness. It's not that they necessarily liked those things, but they didn't freak out when they had an empty moment. And now we've become so accustomed to having things at our fingertips that we turn to it automatically. And as Luke said, that didn't start 15 years ago. The radio, the phonograph, the telephone, all of these were marketed to people 100 years ago with the promise that if you had empty moments, these would fill it. And so it's been like a century-long history of us being trained to turn to these devices. And social media is only the most recent one, but television surely took up a lot of space and time as kind of a pacifier before that.
Well, well, let me just say this because I just went on this little trip and I went to the a museum around music. But one of the things that they showed, which I have seen these images before, are families gathered around the first radio, right? Like they're all just sitting there looking at a box.
I've seen pictures like that. They're amazing because it seems so minimal, right?
They're wrapped in attention looking at the box. There's not even a picture. So go ahead, Luke.
I mean, I think that imagery is something that's crops up again and again in American history. We are not the first Americans to worry about new technologies and what they're doing to us. And so if you look at even newspapers from the early 20th century, you'll see pictures of people hooked up to different devices and captions that sort of capture these anxieties, these worries. So they aren't of recent vintage. I think one thing that might really interest your audience, I think, is or any audience that sort of is struggling with or thinking about their feelings and their emotions and how to how to work with them, is one of the sort of the methodological, well, I shouldn't use that sort of highfalutin a word, but one of the approaches that we use in our book is to think of emotions and feelings not as stuff that are strictly biological, but are things that are actually shaped by the world around us, by our technologies, and by the language that we use, and that so that throughout American history, our technologies have changed and our language has changed, and as a result of that, the way that we experience our emotions is reframed by this new language and by these new technologies. And knowing about how they're reframed and reshaped can maybe make us have a sort of a deeper understanding of the way we're feeling, and that we don't necessarily always have to feel the way we do. We don't have to see our feelings as just sort of natural feelings that are just sort of upwelling from inside of us, but that are reshaped by the world around us and by our history. And that's, fundamentally what we're trying to get at our book is how has the experience of boredom, which we take as sort of such a natural feeling, or the feeling of loneliness, how is our experience today in the 21st century sort of reframing those emotions in a way that is sort of contingent and depends on the place and time that we live in, and that 30, 50, 100 years ago we might have felt very differently about those things, and being able to recall how people in the past reacted to being alone or monotony, and comparing it to the way that we react to those situations today may give us some insights into ways that we may be able to respond in a more healthy way to these feelings.
I love this because we get so caught up in thinking that what is going on for us is the absolute truth, right? Versus like, oh, there's a whole different way to approach it. So what did you guys learn in your research? How did earlier generations really experience loneliness or solitude? How did they find meaning in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think the iconic. I mean, every emotion that we talk about in our book has. We can speak to them, but I think the iconic one is the way Henry David Thoreau, sort of a famous philosopher and sort of thinker of the 19th century, thought about being alone, and he's famous for he lived in the Boston area, and his parents had a pencil factory, but he kind of got fed up with just the world of business, and he went west. I think I forget how many miles, but just a bit outside of Boston, and then built a cabin beside a place called Walden Pond, and then and lived there by himself. And then wrote, a few books that are famous today, sort of canonical in American political thought. But Henry David Thoreau is famous for celebrating solitude. That the way of talking about being alone isn't something that should be condemned with the word like being lonely, but that you should experience it as solitude. And he celebrated that sense of being alone as a way of becoming more creative, living off the grid, and being able to produce all this stuff that he felt that he couldn't have done as ably had he, been in Boston proper, surrounded by people all the time.
Yeah, and throughout the 19th century, I mean, there are others less famous than Thoreau who talk about. Sometimes they'll say they're lonely and it's painful, and this is not to deny the pain of being alone, but people also saw that there was meaning in aloneness, and even meaning in being lonely, that it could teach you things. You could learn to be with yourself. Some believed it was like a window to divine revelation. Others believed it made you better when you came back to society, that you'd kind of had time to kind of recapture yourself. And so one thing we do in the book is we trace the history of these words, loneliness and solitude. And solitude was a much more common way of talking about being alone in the 19th century, and it's kind of declined now. It's a positive way of talking about it. Loneliness was used. Lonesomeness was also used, but they've become a more frequent way of talking about it. And so one thing we argue is our culture has pathologized being alone over the course of the 20th century. The word loner comes into the language in the late 1940s. And, Henry David Thoreau, I guess you could call him a loner, but he was this really positive character. And the phrase today is seen as not so positive, right? So over time, we've come to worry more about those moments when we're alone. And technology companies have certainly heightened those anxieties and telling us that happiness is being always connected all of the time.
Well, yeah. So if one of our listeners is wanting to understand what is healthy solitude and what is unhealthy being alone, right? Or what you're doing with the feelings that come up when you're in solitude, how can they start to rethink those moments through so that it is creating more meaning and fulfillment in their life, or using that solitude to leverage the path, right? Their walk on the path towards fulfillment or meaning?
Yeah, I think part of the answer there is at least being attendant to the past and knowing that these things may not have absolute answers to them. What was healthy for someone in the 19th century might be sort of defined differently today. And one thing we do say in the book is sort of people's expectations for the number of friends that they wanted to have was different in the 19th century than it was today. So if today, whatever number you want to attach to it, if today we don't feel like we have enough friends, if we don't have 40 or 50, in the 19th century, it could have been less than that. And so it's a relative figure that's partly bred by the expectations we have and the way those expectations are given to us, or sort of given to us by the world around us. So there's a whole industry, sometimes called the loneliness industry. This developed probably from the 1970s onwards, which has been often touting the message that you need friends, that you need a lot of them, and that wasn't as present in the 19th century. And so, as a result of that, our expectations about the amount of connection that we have with others is greater than it was in the 19th century. So we're more prone, perhaps, the irony or the paradox is, even though that we may be more connected than our ancestors were, we're at least we're prone to as much loneliness because our expectations have increased. And so perhaps part of the answer to that is sort of re-examining your expectations and going, well, maybe I have too many expectations, and that the number of friends I have is perfectly fine, especially if you measured it, by Thoreau's standards.
Yeah, by quality and not quantity. So when you're in this, and I think if someone is looking at this, as a way to examine what's missing in their life, right? Like if they want to share their life with someone and they are having experiences of monotony or loneliness or being alone, and they're using technology to mask something, right? Like an actual feeling they don't want to deal with, which then perpetuates that comparative despair, right? Which is what you're talking about. We're like, it's not enough. I'm not enough. How do you get out of that so that you can actually find the truth in the feelings and then use that to, move forward?
One person, we interviewed a lot of contemporary Americans from across the nation for the book. And one woman introduced us to the concept of JOMO, the joy of missing out. And so much of our book feeds promote FOMO, the fear of missing, which I think heightens people's sense of loneliness, envy, and isolation. And again, there's nothing like a Facebook feed to make you feel like you're not in the thick of things, even if there is no thick of things, right? It gives you this illusion that someplace there's a center where lots of people are doing things and you're not part of it. And her solution was to, like you, to give social media a break and realize that there was a joy in missing out on all of that and being where you were in that moment and not engaging in the social comparisons, which are so often, as we all know, based on illusion, right? That you're only taking the happy selfie, not the sad selfie. That these are not spontaneous moments, but very planned moments that people are projecting, and that they aren't necessarily reflective of any underlying emotional reality, right? That what you see on your friend's feed is not necessarily how they feel.
And to Susan's point there, I mean, again, and we've said it before, but I mean, it's worth underscoring or reemphasizing that the words that we use for describing these experiences can have an effect on the way that we interpret them, whether positively or negative. When we use the term FOMO, it's sort of a negative description of being alone, whereas JOMO is a positive one. And we understand these words because they're so present. Well, they're present today, but likewise, if there's JOMO and FOMO, there's also words like solitude and loneliness. And if we describe the state of being alone as loneliness rather than solitude, that sort of inflects the experience differently than if we choose different types of words.
And one more comment just on this. We're probably talking too much, but
no, you're not.
One observation we just make is that along with loneliness in the 20th and 21st century, there's been this expectation that you'll be constantly sociable. I would date it back as far back as Dale Carnegie's classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which sets us all up to need lots of friends. But in any case, if you fail at winning as many friends as you think you have, not only do you feel lonely, but you feel ashamed. You feel ashamed of your loneliness. And so that kind of, if we didn't have that social ideal, which is unrealistic, that so many of us are aspiring to, it would diminish the pressure.
I love this. Go ahead, Luke.
No, and again, just following up on Susan's point, and she can actually elaborate on this better than I can. But in the early 20th century, there were things actually called loneliness clubs, in which people would, because there was a lot of mobility in the United States from day one, but there was lots of mobility in the early 20th century, and people would move from Boston to, Los Angeles or something, and then feel lonely, and that happens today as well. But you don't hear the term loneliness club being used today the way it was in the early 20th century. And it's indicative of sort of a new way of sort of understanding that particular word and that particular feeling. I mean, the fact that you could unashamedly join a loneliness club suggests that, people were less ashamed of the emotion than they are today. And maybe that's worth recalling. And that, if you are feeling lonely right now, that maybe like the people in the early 20th century, if you are feeling shame about it, maybe you shouldn't.
I love this. I have to interrupt you here because I think this is so important for our listeners. Like there's so much shame in being alone or being single or not being partnered, right? And then that makes one say, I don't want to claim what I actually want, right? Like that I want a relationship, that I want to build a bigger community, because we're embarrassed of it. Whereas in what I hear you saying is in a different era, it was like, oh, I'm lonely. There's no shame in that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out. I'm going to go to the modern day version of a loneliness club, whatever that is, because there's so many options online, offline to create. But when we're stuck in that shame, we just isolate and pick up our phones and feel shittier, basically.
Yeah. And, so much of it is we have that illusion of togetherness on the phone. But if you actually went to a less lonely club or a loneliness club, people were actually physically together in one place. And, I'm reminded by your earlier comment of the family gathered around the radio box, and it was a boring looking radio box, but the family was actually together, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so, one thing we're tracing is over the course of the 20th century, these technologies are sending us into our own rooms, sending us into our own homes,
Yep.
and not having these shared spaces anymore, which I think heightens the emotion of loneliness and also clearly diminishes the opportunity for meeting people.
Oh my gosh, totally. Well, that's a whole other topic, right? Like kids that my kids are older now, but I remember being so nervous that they were just all in their room on their devices and like forcing them to like spend time with us as a family because it's so important. Well, let me ask you this, because I made a note and I circled it. If you are thinking about, what the pandemic did to heighten one's sense of loneliness or solitude, what do you, and I'm really curious about what are people going to do with it? Are they just going to go back out and be like, never mind, all that stuff that I thought I learned, I'm just going to go back and, hide out in whatever behaviors weren't serving me? Or do you think that people are going to use those moments of loneliness or solitude to do something different? What do you guys think based on what you know from the past?
Oh boy, that's a good question. And, I think there's been so much analysis in the press lately about people saying, we need to sort out what's worthwhile and what to discard from the last year. And that it has had some new habits and new patterns that might be worth preserving. It certainly has been a year, obviously, where we've become ever more dependent on technology. And maybe that's one pattern we want to be thoughtful about, not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but
we don't, just to interject, I mean, we need to have our reservations about technologies, but at the same time, we don't want to vilify it, right? It's
right.
The Zoom and all these sort of technologies of connection have been allowed us sort of in some ways to be physically distant, but still maintain connections with others. But sorry, I'm just interjecting here.
No, that's good. It's just Luke and I on this point, I'm always the technology is making us decline over the long trends, and he's much more optimistic about technology. So that's something we're always going back and forth on. But in the context of COVID, it's undeniable how helpful it has been. Nevertheless, I was noticing that in England, Parliament is considering spending more money on park benches and lighting for public places, just to get people to hang out more. And it's not necessarily saying you can't be hanging out on your phone while in the park, but just to get people out of their houses and back into the public sphere seems like something we could be thoughtful about as well. That, one thing we've certainly learned from the pandemic is we need each other, right? And what we want to be thoughtful about, what's the best way of approaching that need and coping and grappling with that need.
Yeah. And to follow up on that point, I mean, who's the author of Fulfillment?
Alec MacGillis.
Alec MacGillis, I think he's a Washington Post reporter who just wrote a book called Fulfillment. In his book, he's talking about that Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the fulfillment centers. And, over the course of the last year, a lot of the ways we got our satisfactions were through sort of clicking on different things on Amazon and buying them. And what he cautions in part in his book is that, yes, that is a form of fulfillment. We've been able to buy a lot of nice groceries that made us happy. We've been able to get a lot of movies that, we ordinarily wouldn't have watched. But that we shouldn't just sort of think of fulfillment in those kind of, in terms of just consumption, the way that Amazon has sort of defined that word, like fulfillment centers. Fulfillment centers.
Yeah.
They give you products to buy. We should think of fulfillment in sort of a broader, more comprehensive sense, that fulfillment is about actually connecting with other people. And that's about not just clicking on products and buying them, but getting back out into, it's a highfalutin sociology word, into the public sphere, meaning, go to restaurants, go to parks, sit on park benches, see other people. And that we need to think about fulfillment in this more spiritual way, that it's about actual human connection with other people and not just sort of buying products on Amazon.
Yeah,
Oh
and
my
McGillis
gosh,
does say
that's
the part
amazing.
about McGillis focuses more on the kind of economics of Amazon and brings up the fulfillment centers in that context. But we saw these connections, that notion of fulfillment had also kind of affected how we were considering personal fulfillment.
Well, I think that's so true, right? And a lot of that clicking on or clicking are the ability to just click off too, right? Like, it's causing us this idea of, like I can be self-reliant. And when you add that shame piece in, Susan, that you talked about, I do think there's an opportunity to get the hell outside without and thank you also, Luke, for not vilifying technology, because I can do that. And now I can do that. But I think there are so many amazing things that it has created for all of us. So when you look at this idea then that if we are using social media, would you say that, based on your research, that it is making us narcissistic and, obsessed with FOMO and what we look like? Is it contributing to a decline in our fulfillment, and our mental health?
Well, one thing, kind of when we put together these different mini stories, we
on each emotion
that we collected in the book, looking at boredom, how it was experienced in the past, how it's experienced today, loneliness, and so on. One overarching pattern we saw emerge was that we think there's a kind of new sense of self that many Americans are experiencing, certainly not all, but many, which is a sense of limitlessness, that our technology has kind of made us think we can have unlimited contacts 24 hours a day from around the globe, that we can have unlimited stimulation,
unlimited dates,
yeah, romantic partners, and unlimited affirmation, that we can always get a like or a thumbs up or a heart, and we become kind of more habituated to searching for that, it's made us feel more, given people a sense of limitless opportunities. That's not always matching what reality has to offer us. That, as humans, we're inherently finite, mortal, flawed, sometimes not surrounded by people or stimulation, but technology has certainly ramped up our expectations of limitless possibility, which can be exciting, but also disillusioning, right?
Yeah,
because it isn't always borne out.
So what do you guys recommend? Like, how do you take what you have learned and put that into, like, what are some questions our listeners can start to really, ask themselves, or some behaviors they can start to, question or shift? What's the way we can kind of start to take this information and perspective and apply it in our own lives?
Yeah, right. I think people are always searching for sort of practical solutions to, the pain that they're feeling in their life. I don't know, if I drink one less cup of coffee in the morning or have one less nightcap, maybe that's the solution. And I think what we're getting at, and we don't have self-help in the title of our book, but we ultimately think of our book as a self-help book, and that part of self-help is being attendant to the words that we use for describing our experiences, and being aware also that how Americans have responded to these experiences changed over time, and being aware of those differences is a form of self-help. It can make us understand that the way that we're reacting to the world, that we could actually react differently. That when we are alone, we don't necessarily have to say, oh, I'm worried that we're being lonely. We could go, oh, well, maybe I'm just alone, but I can reframe this experience as actually productive, or that it's actually solitude, or there's a way to celebrate it. Likewise with, and we haven't talked about, feeling like narcissism, which we have a chapter on, but you shouldn't feel necessarily ashamed, or that there's two ways of feeling about vanity and narcissism. You can think of it as vanity and pride, but you can also think of it as self-esteem, and understanding the differences, and how Americans have sometimes interpreted it as pride and vanity, and other times as self-esteem, can give you choices about how you or think of those feelings today. When maybe when you're getting ready to go on a date, should you doll yourself up? Well, you might feel there are messages in society, that we police ourselves about being overly narcissistic. And that can make you feel ashamed. But then there's also ways of going, well, no, I mean, this is totally appropriate. I should feel a sense of self-esteem before I step out and begin dating. And understanding that history, I think, is a form of self-help.
I love that. Susan, what do you add?
Yeah, I mean, just that, we often think about our emotions as hardwired, and that every human being has the exact same repertoire of feelings, and knowing that, in fact, our emotions are a result of culture and our own reaction to what we're feeling, that they aren't just pure, can give us the opportunity to realize we can change our emotions, that they aren't set in stone, and that we can figure out what we value and what we don't. And, one thing we ended up thinking about as, we worked on these different emotions for about a decade in terms of researching them. And it definitely made us more self-conscious about what we were feeling and why we were feeling. And was I feeling lonely because I was without people, or because I had suddenly gotten these expectations from, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, to that connection was going to be easy and frictionless and automatic. So it definitely has made us more self-conscious to just kind of scrutinize our feelings and not take them as givens, or that by examining them, we can kind of understand why we're feeling what we're feeling. And that can help us also choose how we want to respond to those nudges and prompts.
Yeah. And
I love that. I love just being, first of all, just before you go on, like you just said is so important, like that the feelings are nudges, right? They're nudges. They're here to show us something. And so when you create a story about them, or you feel shame about them, or you mask them, you're missing out on this amazing opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you just take them as uncomplex things, like, okay, I'm angry, I need to be angry, or I'm sad, I'm feeling sad, and not asking, well, why am I feeling this way? Right. Then you're missing an opportunity. Exactly.
Go ahead.
And when you go to a therapist, right, a therapist helps you to reinterpret your feelings and say, well, is that really what you're feeling, or should you feel ashamed of that feeling? Those are often the types of questions that a therapist will ask. Well, I think we're doing the same sort of thing in our book, but we're doing it, through the historical method. By if you just become aware of how other past Americans have responded to these feelings and frame them differently, that's also a form of therapy as well.
I think this is brilliant, because I call it, with my clients, terminal uniqueness, right? Like everyone's like, I'm the worst, I'm the only one who has this. And when you put this in this framework of there's always been technology. It's like, I think sometimes of what my kids are doing, and I imagine, how I used to mock people who thought rock and roll was like horrible and scary and like from the devil, It's like, right? It's like we've always had change. We've always been confronted by change and innovation. And that if we can put it in perspective, then we understand, number one, that we're not alone, and that parts of our humanity are ever present. And then what do we do with that? That is really empowering, I think, and really removes a lot of those pieces of shame. The other thing I'm making notes while you guys are talking, because there's a million things I want to add in and highlight about what you said. But one of the things that we do when we work with clients is we put them on what we call a dating fast, basically a cleanse, and so that they can stop the that they can have space, right? They can actually intentionally create solitude. To be with their feelings and to see what bubbles up and to see how, filling their inbox or swiping or whatever it is masking a lot of things and also creating negative emotions about themselves that aren't true. And so I love this idea of destigmatizing solitude. And using it as an opportunity to be intentional and really make choices about who you are and what you really want in your life, rather than what we think it should be because of what others are doing. So I freaking love it.
Yeah, and that really does resonate with what we from some 19th century moralists, preachers who would tell their congregations, spend some time alone. And this is not a way ultimately of being, a hermit, but that actually spending time by yourself will ultimately make you more sociable. And it sounds like perhaps you're engaging in or at least that to me seems to resonate with what you're counseling some of your clients to do. And spending time alone can ultimately make you, a more friendly person or more capable of engaging with others. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to fall completely out of practice. And maybe that's a good way of looking at the past year, right? That we've spent a lot of time alone in the past year. And yes, we're a little bit out of practice. We're a little rusty, but ultimately maybe it'll make us more sociable, more able to appreciate and connect with others, just by having had that time alone. At least that's a more maybe optimistic way of looking at it.
I love this. I find my husband was looking at something on Instagram the other day, and so he showed it to me, and I had a physical reaction of all the input of information. And what I realized in this conversation is when I went to Nashville last week, they're a little bit ahead of the trend, so they're mask free and woohoo and all these people and and it was that same sort of shock to my nervous system of whoa, there's all these people. And I looked on the Instagram and I was whoa, there's all these people, and it feels like it's too much. And so it was really interesting to say where do I want to get used to being what do I want to do with that, right? I want to be more comfortable being around people, and I'm okay with not having all that, input in my brain that's coming from social media. So I think all these questions are so profound, and my takeaway from talking to you all is we get to be intentional, we get to make choices, and all of these things we're not terminally unique. Our ancestors have been dealing with this stuff forever. It's just fancier now.
And quicker.
Much, much quicker. Well, I appreciate both of you being here. I can't wait for people to read your book. The link to the book and everything will be in the show notes. Ladies, you guys are amazing. I am so excited for the work that you're doing, and I think it's so important. And I'm honored that you spent your time here in the Dating Den. And I just love everything that you all are doing. So, ladies, whatever you do, create JOMO and do it with some damn dignity. We'll see you next time in the Dating Den. Bye-bye for now.
Hey, thanks for tuning into today's show. So if being in an intimate relationship in which you feel 100% seen, heard, and accepted by a high caliber man is a priority for you right now, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit for working with me and my team at Dating with Dignity, here's what I want you to do. Just head over to DWD VIP, that's D as in dating, W, D as in dating, VIP.com, and book a call to speak with my team. We'll get on the phone with you for about 60 minutes and you'll get crystal clear on what's stopping you from finding true love right now. We'll also take a look at what you want to create, what you want your whole life to look like when you're able to finally be fully expressed as a woman in a healthy relationship with an incredible guy. And if we can help you get from where you are right now to where you want to be, we will show you the fastest path possible that makes sense for you to do that. We help smart, successful women all over the world solve this one missing piece in their life so they can finally have it all. So to see if we can help you do the same thing, head over to dwdvip.com. I'm Marni Battista, and let's talk soon.